Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of the lockpicking tutorial. In this one, we're going to start working on the actual lock blueprint itself. So we can come down here to the content browser and right click, and we want to create a new blueprint for the lock. And we're actually going to select pawn for this one because if you read, it says a pawn is an actor that can be possessed and receive input from a controller, which is kind of what we want because we want to be able to rotate the bobby pin using the mouse, and we want to be able to rotate the lock using the keyboard. So we're really going to make this a pawn. We're actually going to possess it so that all the input will go into the lock, and we also won't be able to walk around as the player anymore when we're trying to lockpick, which is exactly what we want. So we want to make this a pawn. So click on pawn, and we'll call it BP lockpick. And we're going to want to open this up and add a good amount of stuff here. So make sure you pay attention and try to copy this as best as you can. Because this is a very important setup, and if you get this wrong, then you're going to have, potentially issues. So the first thing we're going to want to do is add like a bunch of these static meshes. So first we're going to want to add component and select static mesh, and this is going to be for the outside of the lock. So we'll say outer lock. Just make sure you rename it to something. Outer lock is probably good. You want to rename it because we're going to need to be referencing these in code later, so it's really important to know which one's which. And then we want to set this to the lock cylinder, I believe is the outer lock. No, it's the other one, lock base. So yeah, set the outer one to lock base, and then make sure you have outer lock selected, and add component, and add another static mesh. And this is going to be the inner lock, so name it inner lock. And this one is going to be the lock cylinder, which is the inside of the lock, as you can see, and it fits nicely on the inside. And then we're actually going to want to rotate this whole thing. So click on the outer lock, and we want to rotate it 180 degrees on the Z. So in the Z, type 180, because we actually are going to want it facing this way. It just makes the math a little bit easier for us. All right, so after that, we can add the screwdriver, which is actually going to be a child of the inner lock. So make sure you have inner lock selected, and then add another static mesh. And this one is going to be renamed to the screwdriver, and add the screwdriver static mesh, like so. And by default, it's just kind of jamming right into the middle of it. We don't really want that. I'm going to use the same values I used in my other project, just because I know they work pretty well. So let me click on it and see what they are. All right, so click on the screwdriver, and then over here on the left, we're going to go with negative 7.62 on the X, and on the Y, we're going to go with 0.43, and on the Z, we're going to go with negative 8.29, and for the rotation, we're going to want 102.73, that didn't work, 102.73, and for the Y, we're going to want negative 15.88, and for the Z, we're going to want 320.52. All right, so after all that hard work, you should see that the end of the pick is going right into the bottom of the lock, so it kind of looks like it's pressing up against it, and it's kind of at a nice little angle. And of course, you can set the rotation of this to be whatever you want, if you think it looks better in a little different ways, but this is the way I have it set up in the video I showed at the beginning. All right, so that's the lock. Next thing we want, you might notice it's a little bit dark. We're actually going to want to add a static light to the scene so that it gives it a little bit of light whenever you're in like a dark place, so it's still easy to see. So come up to the top here, and I get one thing to note, just make sure you're doing this right. Make sure you have this hierarchy set up. So it goes default, scene, root, outer lock, inner lock, screwdriver, and they're all childs of the one above it. So really make sure you have that set up correctly, otherwise you're going to have problems. So click on default scene root, and then add a point light. And again, this one is not going to be a child of this, so it should be on the outside like it is right here. It should be a child of the default scene root. And again, I'm just going to copy the values from my other project, since I spent a good amount of time trying to get it to look nice. So click on the point light, and then on the left here, for the X, we're going to use 95. For the Y, we're going to use 34. For the Z, we're going to use 22. And for the intensity, I'm going to bump it up to 10,000. And again, feel free to change these however you like. This is just what I thought looked good for my project. All right, and then the last, well, sort of the last thing we need is the actual bobby pin. So we'll say add component. Oh, make sure you have the default scene route selected, so it adds it as a child of that. And we'll go to static mesh, and we want this to be the bobby pin. So bobby pin, and select the bobby pin, and we're going to actually make sure you rename it to bobby pin. Bobby pin. And with the bobby pin selected, we're going to set the X to 12. And I think that's the only thing we want to change for that. So you can see it goes right into the middle of the lock, like so. All right, so compile and save that. So you can see now we have the kind of the scene going that we're going to be capturing. And in order to capture this scene, we're basically going to want to create something called, or use something called a render target. Because if you look at the other project, I'm just going to run this again real quick to show you what I'm talking about. If I walk up to the door and press my key, these models are actually 3D models, right? They're fully 3D models. It's not like I'm doing this in 2D space or anything. So what's happening is that this is rendering somewhere in the world, and then it's being captured from a camera, and then whatever that camera is capturing is being rendered out to a texture, and then that texture is being shown on the screen. So that's kind of how that works. And in order to do that, you need to create something called, you need to use something called a render target. And to do that in Unreal, it's pretty, they make it pretty easy. So there's actually a nice component for it. So make sure you have the default scene route selected and add a scene capture component 2D. And you can see it basically adds like a little camera to your scene for where you want the scene to be captured from. So there's a few things we're going to want to set on this camera. If you select the camera, we're going to go ahead and rotate it 180 degrees so it's facing the right way. And then we're going to set the X to 152. And again, feel free to change these. These are just the ones I used for my video. We're going to set the field of view to 60 because we don't really need it to be that large. Let me check if there's other things I set. We're going to want to change this primitive render mode to be use show list only. And basically what that's doing is saying, hey, only renders the things that I'm telling you to render, because later we're going to tell it, explicitly to only render the bobby pin, the lock, and the screwdriver, so it doesn't render the background scene. But for now, just set this to use show list only. And another thing we can change is the max view distance override. We can set this to like 300, and basically this is saying like, how far into the scene do you want this camera to capture? And we really don't want it to capture anything more than 300, because as you can see, the camera is 152 units away from the lock. So, in reality, if you look at my mouse, it's probably only capturing about out to here. And we don't need any more than that. If you move the camera back really far, just make sure you change this value up higher so that it will capture the whole scene. But that's basically what that's doing. And another thing that I should probably just do now before I forget, if you drop down this show advanced section, and then, oh, I have to find it. Oh gosh, okay. Where is this? So under general show flags, there it is. So atmosphere. So this took me like forever to figure out where this was. You want to uncheck this, and I will try to remember to explain why later, but basically this is saying do not capture the atmosphere lighting as part of the scene because it will mess things up. I'll try, because I can't really explain it other than showing you exactly what I mean, and I'll try to remember to do that. Actually, maybe I'm just going to leave it unchecked, and then I'll come back to it later, because I'll see the bug and be like, oh yeah, that's how you fix that. So if you wanna uncheck it now, go ahead. But I'm gonna leave it checked just so I remember to explain why you need to uncheck it, if that makes sense. Okay, so we got our scene more or less set up now, looking pretty good. There's one more really important thing we need to set on this scene capture, and that is the texture target. That's saying which texture do you want me to render this scene to. So in order to do that, we need to create one so that we can supply it here, because currently there's none that we can select from, at least none that we want to select. So back here in the content directory, I'm going to right click and, oh gosh, where is this? Materials maybe? Yeah, so materials and textures, and then select render target. We'll call this RT underscore lockpick. So this is the render target that we're going to be rendering to. And we're going to want to go ahead and open this up. And we want to set the size to a nice looking resolution. So we'll say 1920 by 1080. So it's nice and pretty. And I think all of the other stuff you can basically leave as it is. And we'll go ahead and file, save all, and close that. And then back here we can specify we want it to render to our render target lockpick. So if we compile and save it now, hopefully if we come back here and we open up this, that didn't seem to work. Maybe we need to move the camera. I forget how exactly you get this to show up. Oh, it's because we're not adding anything to the show list, I think. So yeah, the reason it's not showing up is because none of these models are added to the show list, and we've specified to use the show list only. So we need to go to the construction script, and let's see, let me open up my other project again. Okay, so inside of here, we just want to take this default scene route and say, well, we need to grab in the scene capture component and say show only actor components, and it's basically specifying like these are the actors that I want you to show, and we'll drag in the, or I guess we can't do that. We're gonna have to right click and say get self. So we'll drag in our self. So pretty much everything inside of this blueprint we want to show. So now hopefully if I go back to the viewport and I select the scene capture component, yeah, so you can see down here on the bottom right, it's actually rendering this scene into this texture. And if we browse to it and open it up, it will look something like this, and that's totally expected. It's basically just like the mask of where it's rendering it to. So the idea is we want to render this texture to the screen. And in order to do that, we need to create a material out of it. So if you, I guess you can just right click on this and say create material, and we'll call this m underscore lockpick. So if you go ahead and open this up, you can see it looks a little weird right now, and that's because we need to change the type of it. So if you click on this node here on the right, we want to change it to user interface, and we want to hook this up to the final color, and we need to change the blend mode to translucent so that I can have an opacity. And we could, well, you might think we just do this, hook the alpha up to the opacity, but it's actually going to be 1 minus. So if you type 1 minus, and that's just the way Unreal does it. Don't ask me why. So now you can see we have the material rendering our scene, nice and pretty, and we can apply and save that. Okay, so if we go back to the content directory now, we have our material that we're going to want to show on the screen. So now that we have this, we can actually create the widget that we're going to pop up on the screen. So right click and say user interface widget blueprint, and we will call this the lockpick underscore widget. And if we open this up, I think this is going to be pretty simple if I remember correctly. So we want to delete the canvas panel because we don't want that, and we want to add a uniform grid panel instead, so add one of those. And then we want to add a border, which is basically going to be our background. So click on the border, and we want this to be stretched in both directions, and we don't need any padding, so we can get rid of that. And we want to make it like a nice transparent like black color. So come down here to the brush color and change it to like 0, 0, 0, 0.8 maybe. So you can see, you can just kind of barely see through it. So that's going to be our background. And then we're going to add the image for the lockpick itself. So come up here to image and drag that onto the border. And select the image and select the image. Okay, so make sure it's stretched out like it is right now. And for the brush, if we expand this, we want to select that material that we made. So m underscore, if I can spell it, m underscore lock pick, like so. So now you can see this is the material that's going to be rendering to our screen. And that all looks pretty good. And I think that's it for this. Let me just double check my other project. Yes, I think that's it. Okay, so we can go ahead and close that. All right, so now things are going to start getting hopefully not too confusing, but potentially a little bit more confusing. So if you go back to our first-person character, we left ourselves this to-do right here. And this to-do, this code's going to run whenever they press the F key and they're looking at the door. So we essentially want to show this, or not that, we essentially want to show this widget on the screen whenever they are pressing F on the door. So the thing is that we also want them to be able to move the bobby pin around and move the screwdriver around. So we need to actually spawn an instance of this BP lockpick somewhere into the world so that it can be, it can receive input from the player. And the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to stream it in. And we're going to do that for a couple reasons. One reason is just because I think it keeps things a little bit simpler, because when you need it, you'll stream it in, and when you don't need it, you'll stream it out. So to do that, we're actually going to create a special little level just for the lockpick stuff. So come back here to the content directory, and under first person blueprints, under maps, we're going to right click and create a new level. And we will call this lockpick level. And if I open this up, yep, go ahead and save. So this is the level that we're going to be doing everything related to lockpicking in. So you can see by default it's empty, and we're actually going to leave it empty. We're going to be doing everything inside of the level blueprint. So if we open up the level blueprint, like I just did at the top there, this is where we're going to be writing all of the code. So essentially what we're going to be doing is whenever the player decides that he wants to try to lockpick something, we're going to load this level. So I guess we can go back and do that first. So go back to the first person character, and then in this to-do right here, what we're going to do is we're just going to call load that level. So we'll call load stream level and hook this up like so. Get rid of this to-do. And the level we're going to load is the one we just created, which is called lockpick level. Make sure you get this name correctly, otherwise it will not load. And make sure you select make visible after load so that it shows up as soon as it's done loading. So this is going to load our lockpick level, and our lockpick level is going to take care of everything else for us, basically, which makes things a little bit nice. So go back to the lockpick level blueprint. So as soon as that gets called, as soon as the player loads this level or streams in this level, we need to do some things. The main thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to change the possession from the player to the lock, because we want the input. We don't want to be able to have the player walk around anymore. We don't want WASD to walk the player. We don't want the mouse to change where he's looking. We want all the input to only affect the lock. So to do that, we're going to change it so that the player controller possesses the lock instead of the player. And I think this is like a really clean, good way to do this, as opposed to doing a bunch of if checks to determine like, oh, is he, lockpicking something and all that jazz. So to do that, we're going to start out and we're going to get the player character, and we want to cast it to the first person character so that we can get access to all the good stuff. Cast to first person character. And inside of here, or off of here, we want to right click on this and promote it to a variable, because we're going to want to save this. And this, of course, is the player. And we want to save his rotation as well, so that when we go back and possess him again after we're done picking the lock, we can reapply it. So drag off this and say get control rotation, and promote this to a variable as well, so we have access to it later. And again, this is all happening inside of that level blueprint, so it's very nice and concealed. So player controller rotation is what we're going to control, or what we're going to call this, or player control rotation. Like so. And we also want to save the player's camera so that when we go back to possessing him, we can go back to his camera. So we'll say get player controller, and get the viewport, or the view target rather. And this is going to be the camera, so we can right click on this, promote to variable, pick that up, and we're going to rename this to player camera. All right, so at this point, we're going to want to get access to that interface, or the lockpick interface that we're currently trying to lockpick. Because if you remember back in the first person blueprint, as soon as we decided that the door could be picked, we set this object being picked to whatever we collided with. So in this case, it's the interface for the door. And we want to gain access to that. So we need a way to get it. So I'm just going to add a quick little function here called get object being picked. And it's just going to return the object being picked. So drag that in and hook that up like so. And compile and save that. So back in the lockpick level blueprint, we can say player, drag in the player, and say get object being picked, like so. And off of here, we're going to want to actually get the difficulty, because we're going to create the lock differently depending on the difficulty. So say get difficulty, and again, that's an interface call. And so that's going to return to us the difficulty of the object we're being picked, in this case, the door. And from here, we want to spawn the lock. So say spawn actor from class, and we'll drag this in. And the actor that we want to spawn is our BP lockpick, which again is just, this guy. We're just spawning one of these guys into the world. And the spawn transform, so if you go ahead and split this, we basically want to spawn this like somewhere way out of the way. And I know it sounds a little hacky, but there's literally no other way to do this in Unreal, because you have to spawn this somewhere in the world so that you can capture it. So I'm sure for like pretty much all levels, 10,000 is going to be totally fine. You would never see it, or you can put it below the ground somewhere. But 10,000 is probably a good spot. So we're just spawning it like really high up in the air. And it's not going to be affected by like the sun or anything like that. So it doesn't really matter where you put it, but 10,000 on the Z is probably a pretty safe bet. And we want to tell the lockpick to spawn with this difficulty. So we actually want to create a variable for the lockpick that gets exposed on spawn, so that we can specify the difficulty when we're spawning the lock. So I guess we can just go ahead and do that real quick. So go back to the lockpick, and then over here on the left, I'm going to create a new variable. So click the plus variable, and I'll call this difficulty. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Difficulty. And we want to change it to the lockpick difficulty, so lockpick difficulty. And for this one, I'm going to put this in a section, in a category called constants, because it's really not going to be changing once it's set. And since it's constant, we can say that it's blueprint read only. And we also said we want it to be exposed on spawn, so we're going to say expose on spawn. Oops. And we can probably set it as instance editable as well. It doesn't really matter. And we also want it to be private. So check all those checkboxes. All right, and then back in the lockpick level, if we refresh this, you can see we will have the difficulty, which we can hook up like so, which is pretty nice. So now we have the lockpick spawned into the world. After that, we want to save this value, so we'll have access to it later. So promote this to a variable as well, and we're going to call this the lockpick. And off of the lockpick, we're going to want to know when the lockpick is successfully picked. And so to do that, we're going to use something called an event dispatcher. So go back to the lockpick, and over here on the left, there's a section for event dispatchers down here at the bottom. If you go ahead and you click on that, we can create a new one for onPicked. So we're basically going to call this whenever it is successfully picked. And I don't believe we really need any parameters for this. It's really just like an event that gets triggered. So if we compile and save that and go back to our lockpick level blueprint, we can now bind to that event. So I'm just going to create a little reroute node, and I'm going to say drag off this, and if you type assign to on picked, or on, why is it not showing up? Assign, did I not save it? Lockpick, pile save. Should be able to say assign to, it's on picked, why is it not showing up? Okay, I guess it shows up now. Just type, I had to type on pick to get it to show up, but there's a, oh, I guess it's not assigned to, it's probably just assign on, I can't type. Okay, that took way longer than it should, but type assign on picked and it will show up. So go ahead and select that, hook that up like so, drag this down, just make it a little neater. So I'm going to rename this just to make it neat as well. So this is the on pick, and then I'm going to say binding in parentheses. So this event is going to get called whenever the lock is finished, or when the lock is successfully picked. So there's a couple things we want to do when it's picked. I guess we'll come back and fill this out later, though. Yeah, we will. We'll come back and fill this out in a second. So finally, like I was saying at the beginning, we want to actually possess the lock now. So back up to this line of execution. So just to kind of recap, because I know I'm going through a lot of stuff. We save the player, we save the player control rotation, we save the player camera. We get the object that's being picked, we get the difficulty of it. We then create a lockpick with that difficulty. We save the lockpick. We bind to the onPicked event so we know when it gets picked. And then we want to possess the lock. So drag off of this and say, I guess you can't drag off of that. Just right click and say get player controller, and off of this we can say possess. So we're basically saying, hey, the player controller, stop possessing the player, go ahead and possess this lock instead. So at that point it's going to, you're not going to be able to walk anymore or do any of the player controller stuff or the player character stuff. You're only going to be able to do actions that are defined within the lock, like moving the bobby pin. So we're going to possess the lock, and then when we do that, I guess I can probably show you what happens, but actually I probably can't because I don't think I can run it yet. But if you just possess the lock, by default, what it's going to do is it's going to say, oh, this pawn has a camera. Let me go and use this camera. But we really actually don't want to use this camera because this camera is just capturing the scene. We want to keep using the same camera that the player is using. And so in order to do that, we need to, as soon as we possess it, we need to reset the camera. So we'll say set view, or I guess we can't do it off of that. Off of the player controller, we'll say set view target with blend, and hook that up. And the camera that we want to possess is the player camera. So drag in the player camera and hook that up as the new view target. I spelled player wrong, player camera. And then we can leave all of this as it is. And then over here, we need to do a couple more things. We want to actually show this widget to the screen. So we'll say get player controller again, and we will create the widget. So create widget, and the widget we want to create is the lockpick widget. So say lockpick widget, and we will promote this to a variable, and this will be called our lockpick widget. And finally, we want to add to the viewport. Okay, so I know that was probably a lot of stuff, but this is basically all the stuff that we want to happen when the player goes and tries to lockpick something. So yeah, it's really not that confusing. It's just we're just saving a bunch of stuff, and then we're spawning the lockpick itself, and then we're possessing it so we can control it, and then this is just resetting the camera to make sure the camera doesn't move, and then we're showing this widget to the screen. So we can try to go ahead and run it now. I'm not 100% sure if it's going to run at this point. I think it might do something. Okay, well, if you run it on this level, you'll see it actually just shows the It just shows this because it's running this begin play, and it actually yells at you because it's running this begin play and it's running all this code, and then it's spawning the lock. But in reality, you never would run it from this sub level. You'd run it from the main level. So if we go back to the main level and we try to run it. Oh, actually, I know this is not going to work. So if we press F, you'll see it didn't work. And that's because our call to load level is actually failing. So if we go back to the first person character and the event graph, we have this call to load the stream level for the lockpick. But the thing is you can only load stream levels if they're sub levels of the main level. And currently this lockpick level is not a sub level, it's just its own level. So we need to set it as a sub level. And to do that, you come up here to Windows and Levels, and then drag in the lockpick level, and that will say that the lockpick level is a sub level of this persistent level. So now if we go ahead and we run this, and we hit play, and we go up and we press F, you can see that it shows the lockpick right on the screen, which is exactly what we want. So escape out of that. But yeah, obviously we can't move any of the bobby pins around yet or anything like that. And we also can't like press F to even get out of it. We're just kind of stuck in here forever. So we need to start working on that type of stuff next. So back in the lockpick, oh, this is the lockpick widget. One thing that's kind of cool, if you want to access this level's blueprint from the main level, you can come up here to blueprints and say sublevels, and then edit lockpick level. So now we're editing this blueprint again, even though we're on the other level, which is kind of a cool little thing that I figured out. Okay, so one thing that's important is we want to be able to exit this if we decide we want to give up lockpicking. We want to be able to press F again and exit. So inside of here, we can actually do an input action pick lock. So we can listen for that button press. And if it is pressed, then we basically want to unload this level. And when we unload this level, everything else will go away too, because it's part of that level. So instead of doing that here, I'm going to create a custom event for it for unloading. So add custom event, and I'm going to call it unload. And then I'm just going to call that from up here, because we're going to want to unload things from a couple different spots. So when the pick lock function, or when the pick lock action is pressed, it will call the unload event. And then in the unload event, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to want to unpossess the lock and repossess the player so that we can walk around as the player again. So we'll say get player controller and possess, and we want to possess the player, which we saved. And this is exactly why we saved the player, so that we could repossess him when it's time to exit. And we also want to set his control rotation back to what it was before, because when you repossess something, it's going to set your guy to basically looking straight forward again. I don't really know why it does that, but it just does. So we want to reset his player control rotation to whatever it was before he entered the lockpicking state. So drag in the player and say get controller. And off of the controller, we want to say set control rotation, and that will take in the player control rotation that we saved as well. And after that, we want to reset the object being picked inside of the first person character. So, because remember, we set this object being picked whenever we try to pick the door, but whenever we exit, we want to set this back to basically nothing. So just create another function here. This will be super easy. Say set object being picked, and drag in this and set, and drag that over and over, like so. And then back in the lockpick, we will say player set object being picked. And we can just leave this empty, so that way it'll just set it to basically nothing, which is what we want. And then the lockpick widget, we want to remove this, which again is just this thing, because we don't want this to show on the screen anymore when the player exits. So we'll say remove from parent, and hook that up like so. And we want to also destroy the lockpick. Like we want to destroy this guy because we no longer need this in the world anymore. So we'll drag in the lockpick. and we'll say destroy actor. And finally, the very last thing we want to do is we want to unload this stream level because we no longer need it. So we'll just say unload stream level, and we just type the name of ourselves, so lockpick level. All right, so we can go ahead and test this out now. Compile and save all. So if we go back and rerun this, if we press F, we go into the lockpick, and if we press F again, we come back out of it. Press F again, we go back in. And yeah, we can do it as many times as we want. So the next thing we really need to do is set it up so that we can, obviously rotate this lock, and actually write the logic to do the lock picking. So I'm going to do that in part 3. So I will see you in part 3.